prior to 1935, did events like this take place on a global scale? And is history repeating itself? And are we moving towards a worldwide conflict? That's the question, because there's too much that's happened post 2020. It's not a normal 4 years. Especially if you observe geopolitics, you know that too much has happened in the last 4 years. Lots of spiritualists who've been on the show believe that the world is heading towards war. I have the same question for you as a student of history as well as geopolitics. Is there any reality behind this thought?
I mean, that's if you don't mind, I'll try and give you a little bit of a broad response that should cover the historical as well as the current affairs parts of your question. So, if you don't mind, I'll take a step back and discuss a little bit of theory within the study of international relations as well. So, taking a historical perspective first, Ranveer, what you see really is the development of the sovereign state as a political concept is relatively recent. If you go back far enough in history, kingdoms, empires used to make war against each other just because they felt like it. So the standard of conduct between states, from a moral perspective, didn't include some sort of prohibition from invading each other. In fact, it was almost a survival of the fittest, a state of nature that existed as far as international society was concerned. Domestically, you'd have laws and you'd have kings and you'd have, policing and governance and social rules, etc., howsoever constructed. But you'd have some rules that people are following, even in history. But internationally, it was really not a rules-based society. It was might is right. If I have the ability as a major kingdom to go and conquer a neighboring smaller kingdom, then I'm going to do it. And I don't need to give myself or anybody else any justification to do that. Where does all of that start to change? It starts to change in 1648 with this event that marked the end of a conflict in Europe called the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was this continent-wide conflict fought along both religious and political lines between two subsects of Christianity, because the Lutheran movement and the Calvinist movement were effectively trying to rebel against the power of the Catholic Church. And so what ended up happening is that all the kings and dukes and princes of Europe ended up choosing one of the two sides. Either they remained loyal to the Catholic Church led by the Pope in Rome, or they, in fact, for their own local political reasons, decided that throwing in their lot with these reformist Christians makes more sense. And that led to, as you can imagine, whenever you combine religion with politics, the levels of violence seen end up, being quite extreme. And so you see this utter destruction of Europe occur over the next 30 years, and that war ends with the Diet of Westphalia, I should just use, with the Conference of Westphalia that happens in this town in Germany called Westphalia, where all of the powers of Europe come together and for the first time, Ranveer, announce the principle of national sovereignty and say, listen, there's a map, we're all agreeing who owns what, and for the first time, we're saying that it is no longer legal for us to go after each other's land. Now, obviously, that didn't mean that war ended. War has continued even since 1648. It happened before, it's happened after. But there was a very important change that occurred in the way we thought about the international society, that for the first time, people acknowledged that we need some rules to exist, even in terms of how countries behave with each other or states or nations behave with each other. Fast forward a few hundred years, you have World War I, you have World War II. At the end of World War I, the world is so devastated, just like after the 30 Years' War. So you establish the League of Nations. That ends up being a failed project. World War II breaks out, and you finally have the establishment of the United Nations. Now, the whole point of establishing the United Nations and creating public international law and creating some of these principles of how, nations are supposed to behave with each other was to try to impose some rules on the international system. A rules-based order is what we were seeking to create after the Second World War, because people were just like, boss, we can't let this happen again. Because our generation was born at the end of the Cold War, Ranveer, we actually got to enjoy this unique American unipolar moment where not only did the United Nations exist and not only did this global rules-based order exist, but also you had one clear foundation for that international order, which is the United States. And so I think we ended up living in an era, and I go back to when I was a student at the LSE, where there was a real belief that the international system is becoming more and more rules-based and less might-based every year. That we're moving closer and closer to, if you and I get into a dispute or disagreement domestically as Indian citizens, I don't assemble an army and come to you and try to invade your apartment or whatever in order to resolve the dispute. Instead, we'll go to courts, or we'll have arbitration, or we'll have some rules-based dispute resolution mechanism. That really is what was absent in the international system, and that's what the creation of this international law and diplomacy post-World War II was meant to resolve for, so that countries feel that they have peaceful ways to resolve disputes. The challenge, of course, was always the fact that, unlike in domestic society, you have no common source of legislation and you have no common form of enforcement. We clearly are subject to Indian law. If you're in America, you're subject to US law. And there's a police force and there are courts. So it's very clear what the sources of your rules are. In the international system, there is no world court. There's an international court of justice, there's an international criminal court, but it's not universally accepted by everyone as a court of last recourse, nor is there a global police force. So even if two nations get into a dispute with each other and really maybe diplomacy is the answer, or maybe conversation is the answer, and there's even some sort of judgment issued, how are you going to enforce? And, you have a lot of examples that I can, give you. For example, Argentina defaults on billions of dollars of debt. This happened in the 80s and 90s and stuff like that. What are you going to do to enforce? You've got investors on Wall Street that are trying to look after, go after some sort of enforcement action through international courts, and the Argentinians are just no. And so suddenly you see the limits of international law as well, because we don't have a world government.
You can't govern the earth.
I mean, well, in theory, one can create a one world government and all that, but that's just not the reality of the system that we live in. So those are the limits of international law. Now, the reason I've given you this broad background is, I remember as a student at the LSE also believing that every year we might create more and more of an international society where not only do certain formal rules exist, but also that we feel obligated to not go to war just for the sake of it, or not use violence just for the sake of it in the international arena. Because we feel a sense of obligation that, look, there is an international society that exists. We're all a part of this, one planet. And so maybe diplomacy is the answer, or maybe conversation is the answer. Unfortunately, Ranveer, I started observing, in the early 2000s, that the reality is that we may be retreating rather than moving closer and closer towards an international society. There has been, over the last 20 years, a retreat of global norms rather than a development of global norms. You're seeing more and more countries feeling freedom to undertake military operations, freedom to utilize violence, freedom to interfere in each other's domestic politics. Countries feeling hey, actually, I can, elbow my neighbor and no one seems to show up to do anything about it. And so, it's been a very, very complex process, including technological change, global economic change, the rise of new powers like China and India, in many ways, the weakening of American empire globally. But what you're seeing now is the world being categorically at its most unstable, I would argue, since the end of World War II. And the reason I say that is that despite the fact that the Cold War was responsible for a lot of hard conflict all over the world, there was still a fundamental logic or structure to it, where you had these two superpowers and they knew at the end of the day that we don't really want to create a total conflict. And so conflicts ended up remaining quite controlled, quite limited. There's a conflict in Vietnam, okay, it's in Vietnam. There's a conflict in Afghanistan, it's in Afghanistan. Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States were never going to allow for a global conflagration to occur. And between the two of them, they had the ability to wield influence sufficiently all over the world that they were in a position to police the world. For the last 20 or 30 years, in theory, America has been single-handedly in a position to police the world. But the reality is that the limits of American power are being tested. micro conflicts are becoming major conflicts all over the world, and we can go through a list of them. And powers are increasingly showing willingness to undertake conventional warfare despite this international rules-based system. So all of that to say that if you ask me, I would agree from a theoretical and an observational perspective that the return of major state-on-state conflict, which we had all sort of almost like taken out of our minds, we don't go to war anymore, that's definitely happening. The chances that we see minor conflicts snowballing into major conflicts, the chances that we see a sort of domino effect of a small incident somewhere in this globally interconnected world leading to a series of unforeseen consequences, very, very possible. And so in many ways, my perspective is that this is an increasingly dangerous world with geopolitical instability rather than stability, unpredictability rather than predictability. And it's a global context in which all countries, but especially in India as a growing, developing economy, we have to focus on self-reliance. We have to focus on internal economic strength. We have to focus on the ability to create strategic space for ourselves and not end up being vulnerable to incidents and events that are external to us. Ranveer, I think we're also going to have to make a choice as Indians on whether or not we're open to alliances. Because one of the things that India has maintained for a long time is partnerships, pragmatic, issue-based partnerships with potentially anyone and everyone. But we've really tried to steer clear of formal alliances because we believe that it ends up reducing our freedom of maneuver on the world stage. I think that's going to be a difficult position for us to maintain going forward. And a day will come when we're going to have to choose effectively between, if not two, then maybe three sides. But I can see a world that starts to break up into two competing systems. And we really are a swing state in that sense, right? A major state that's not clearly aligned to the West and not clearly aligned to the Russia-China axis that exists as opposition to the West. So
what's the third pole?
Yeah, I mean, there's... So the reason I said potentially three is because Russia and China are not actually as close as recent events would have you believe. The reason the Indo-Russian relationship has been as strong as it has is because actually both nations have a little bit of a mistrust of China. And so in many ways, the closeness of the Russian relationship with China today is driven by the fact that the West has sort of pushed Russia into a corner rather than Russian willingness or desire to, work very closely with China. In case you're interested, I'll just give you a small piece of evidence to back that up as well. In the 2000s, Russia built major economic infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure, to serve European markets, not Chinese markets. They ended up investing billions in their own assets in Western markets, not in Chinese markets. Russian assets would be held in Western banks, not in Chinese banks. And the specific infrastructure I'm referring to, obviously, is Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, the huge gas pipelines with an investment of over 15 billion jointly executed by European nations and Russia. Now, all of those are really expensive, really important signals that Russia was trying to send to the West, saying, we'd like to integrate. We'd like to be closer. We'd actually like to, join the economic project that the West is in. And, the only kind of subtext or conditionalities that the Russians had were, don't try to interfere with internal Russian policies. Don't try to, wield influence inside Russia. Let's do business. And, it is truly my opinion, Ranveer, that if not for the events in Ukraine, and we can cover those in detail if you like, this Russia-China partnership is not as natural as you think.
If you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out these curated playlists that we've made especially for you related to the subject that was spoken about in this clip.